The purpose of this unit is to introduce everyone to the study of global political economy, or what I sometimes call as a shorthand, the global economy. To start off with, I do want to clarify one thing. Studying the global economy does not mean studying economics. Economics is a very quantitative, math-driven discipline at the university level, and of course also in government and in the private sector. When we talk about the global economy or global political economy, what we're really talking about is the study of the institutions and the rules and the procedures and the practices that help make the global economy run, or of course in some cases not run. In order to clarify some of the things going on in your textbook on this topic, and in order to help you see some of the dynamics of the global economy around you today, we are going to start our story in World War II with the Bretton Woods system. We are going to then take it forward in time into the era of Fordism, Taylorism, and Keynesianism, and then into the current era, which is often called the post-Fordist era. In all of these cases, what we are looking at are really two sets of things. On the one hand, how do people accumulate capital? How do they make money? Where does wealth come from at this point in the global economy? And two, how are the rules set? The Bretton Woods system, as we'll see, is a system of rules. It is a system of institutions that lays down what is and isn't okay in the organization of the global economy. Fordism and Taylorism are modes of production. They are ways of accumulating wealth and ways of accumulating capital and ways basically of making money. Keynesianism, on the other hand, is another set of rules that we'll talk about as we go through this material. To start at the end of World War II. It's 1944. The war is coming to a close. Germany is going to lose. And there was a lot of fear amongst the global elite, for lack of a better term, that a new economic depression will set in after the war is over. There is even more fear that this economic depression will lead to more extremism and more political violence, just like the ones earlier had and had led to fascism and totalitarianism. So in 1944, the global elite, basically a series of finance ministers, treasury ministers, and sometimes heads of state, get together in the little town of Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. And they hash out what is basically almost a global economic constitution, with the global economy sitting squarely on the shoulders of the US. We in the US are going to set the rules and in a lot of ways set the template for economic activity and economic life on a global scale. Specifically, the Bretton Woods system is going to set up a few new institutions. These are the IMF, the GATT, and the World Bank. The IMF was initially designed to act as an insurance fund for countries facing balance of payments problems, in other words, who were having to pay out more money than they were generating and receiving. The idea behind the IMF, or the International Monetary Fund, was that if a country was in a bind, if a country was in a crisis, they would have what is known in economics as a lender of last resort. They would have somebody who would never close the door on them and never hang up the phone on them. Later on, as we'll see a little bit later, the IMF's role is going to expand quite a bit from this, but this is the way it was conceived of at that time. The GATT is a trade agreement. It is not an institution, and it was designed to reverse the protectionism of the 1880s to the 1930s and help bring developing and decolonizing countries into the global trade system. From the 1880s onwards, many countries had put up trade and tariff barriers so that imported goods would cost more than goods made domestically. This was a contributing factor to the Great Depression of the 1930s. And it was thought that by encouraging free trade, countries would be more and more tightly tied to each other, and ultimately less likely to go to war. The World Bank, initially called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, was designed for large-scale loans over a long time period to developing countries. This is quite different again from the IMF, and it is very important that you not get these institutions confused. The IMF was designed to provide cash on a short time frame for countries facing an immediate balance of payment problems. The World Bank was designed to provide large-scale development assistance over the course of many years, generally focused, at least at the beginning of the World Bank's existence, on large-scale public works, transportation, electrification, building schools, building hospitals, and so forth. All of these institutions were basically designed to reorganize global economic activity on a more stable and sustainable basis. And they were all dominated by the Western powers, something that's very apparent when you examine the leadership of the IMF and the World Bank. Tradition has always held that the IMF is headed by a European, and the World Bank is headed by an American. And that has continued well into the 2000s. In 2009, Dr. Jim Yong Kim, who is Korean American, became the Director General of the World Bank. In 2011, Christine Lagarde, who is French, became the first woman to head up the IMF. In the Bretton Woods system, it's good to be the US. Basically, the Bretton Woods system establishes the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. This is another way of saying that the US dollar is kind of the benchmark for all other global monies. Other currencies are pegged to the US dollar, and their value only goes up and down insofar as the US dollar value goes up and down. The US dollar, in turn, is pegged to the value of gold. And this is seen as a way of stabilizing currencies on a global scale, and of establishing a certain kind of trust and faith in economic transactions. It stands obviously to reason that if you're going to be signing contracts that are going to extend over many years, you would like to know and be able to trust that the value of the currencies in which you're signing those contracts aren't going to radically rise and fall over the course of those years. The Bretton Woods system, in particular the US dollar gold convertibility mechanism, was designed to provide that kind of assurance. Under this system, the US has basically what is referred to as seigniorage, the ability to print the world's reserve currency as it deems fit, or not print it as it deems fit. This provides huge advantages for US corporations that want to expand overseas. In the 50s and 60s, when IBM wants to expand in Japan, it's very easy for them to do so. After all, they have a US headquarters. That US headquarters can always borrow US dollars. Other transnational corporations based in other countries don't quite have such easy access to US dollars. They have some access, but it's complicated and it takes longer to access them. What this means is that the US in the 1950s and the 1960s is going to have a huge head start, setting rules and basically creating and crafting a global economy in its own image. Well, this is basically giving you an overview of the rules through which the global economy works in this period of time. So, at a day-to-day level, how is wealth created and how is affluence created? Well, this is where the concepts of Fordism and Taylorism are really very useful. Fordism, basically, is mass production for mass consumption. Under Fordism, the idea is that you can make a lot more money selling lots of products at a small markup as opposed to selling fewer products at a larger markup. Production is vertically integrated, so one company makes everything in the case of motor cars, from the rubber in the tires to the plastics in the dashboard and so on and so forth. There is a minimum wage, which in those days is relatively speaking fairly generous. Workers are given 8-hour workdays, with the idea of turning producers into consumers. Workers, in Ford's thinking, should be able to buy the products they're making. Just in case production techniques include things like warehousing, in other words, having a lot of material on hand to be able to increase production at a moment's notice without having to get involved in quickly sourcing materials from far away. And social regulation becomes a natural byproduct of corporate control. Ford saw himself and saw his model really not simply as making more money, but as creating new kinds of workers who would be focused on doing one and only one thing on an assembly line, and really increasing their efficiency as a cog in the broader Fordist production machine. While this of course applies to the auto industry, it applies to all kinds of industries, from chemicals to furniture to textiles to meat packing and so forth. Taylorism is the scientific management of the workplace and really goes in hand in a lot of ways with Fordism. Frederick Taylor was a workplace scientist who would engage in what were referred to as time motion studies, measuring the motions and the gestures of each worker and finding ways to make these more efficient. Each turn, each bodily movement was timed, was assessed, and new technologies were discovered in order to make each of those movements go a little bit faster and go a little bit more smoothly. In hand with this, you also see the emergence of workplace surveillance and control systems to make sure that workers are actually moving in this new, very efficient way, and to correct them when they, in a sense, go off the plan a little bit and start doing things they ought not be doing. Well, Fordism and Taylorism become, in a sense, the template for how big business makes money in the post-World War II era, in the US and in many developed and developing countries around the world. These are a couple of images. The Fordist Motor Factory on the left, that is in fact the Ford Motor Company putting together trucks. And on the right, Frederick Taylor timing an employee, and then entering the data into a sheet like this. Remember, this is all before a computer, so when you were working with large bodies of data, it all had to be recorded by hand. So in this case, cuts that should have been made with soda water, probably on a lumber yard. And then the amount of time each gesture ought to have taken, the number of cuts each thing ought to have required, in order to find a way to make the whole process more efficient and to crank out more productivity out of industrial production. Now, Ford, in general, while he was a very innovative person in terms of generating new systems of industrial production, was also a fairly strange human being. In the 1940s, during World War II, Ford was worried about the supply of natural rubber to be able to make car tires. And so, in response to this, he colonized 2 villages in the Brazilian Amazon, named them Fordlandia, and tried not only to extract rubber on an industrial basis from these particular places, but also tried to reorganize the lifestyles of workers in the Amazon according to what might be typical, at least in his mind, in a U.S. Midwestern village. Ford had square dancing on Sunday nights in Fordlandia. He had white picket fences running through the villages. And in the form of social experimentation that only he would have come up with at the time, he experimented with giving babies soy milk in nurseries, because he hated cows. No, I don't know why, he just did. Accompanying Fordism was Keynesianism, the policies named for the British economist John Maynard Keynes. Keynesianism was at the time the opposite of many economic orthodoxies of what are referred to as classical economics. The key innovation that Keynes brought to the table was that during a depression, when things aren't going well, you want to, as they say, prime the pump, putting money in people's hands and driving up demand precisely because the free market isn't doing that by itself. During good times, you want to tax the money back precisely because you don't want deficits to get out of control. And there were some things in Keynes's mind, and in the minds of many after World War II, that really shouldn't be put to market prices. Things like education, healthcare, water, basic resources should be available to all at an affordable price. By doing this, Keynes's theory was you build a more robust and more sustainable form of economic growth over the long period. And by golly, this is more or less what happens. In the 1950s and 60s and into the 1970s, unemployment is, and for the most part remains, fairly low. These are some US data. Under 8% at its highest, and then sometimes as low as 2.7% during the Korean War in the 1950s. Overall, economically, things look good. Growth is high, consumption of durable goods is high, people are buying a lot of the stoves and the fridges and the automobiles that are being produced during this period. And generally, Keynesian policies and the Bretton Woods system overall are seen as a roaring success in many respects during this period of time. By the early 1970s, you start to see a change in the ways in which these institutions and these policies are working. First, in 1973, the gold standard ends. President Nixon, realizing the US can't keep printing dollars at a faster and faster rate, ultimately decides to decouple the US dollar from gold, allowing the US dollar, and of course the world's other currencies as well, to float freely. This is going to add a lot to the instability in the world economy, and is going to make a situation in which dollars and currencies are going to sometimes gain and lose value very, very quickly and very dramatically. On top of that, there is more slow growth, or rather growth starts to slow down. Quite simply, there are too many fridges and too many stoves out there, and demand is tapering off. People don't need to replace these things all that quickly and all that swiftly. As a result of this, there is some inflation in the 1970s. People expect prices to go up. As they expect prices to go up, they raise prices in turn. For example, a restaurant will increase prices on its menus. This will cause the restaurant suppliers to increase prices as well. And inflation by the 1970s is becoming a little bit of a concern. Technology is likewise becoming an issue. By the 70s, you start to have the beginnings, the very beginnings of the technology revolution that's going to replace a lot of workers by machines centered on microprocessors. This is starting very slowly to threaten jobs, and is starting to make a lot of workers basically redundant. Trade is likewise going to become an issue. As you get more foreign trade, some workers are going to feel threatened, feeling that their jobs are being replaced by foreign competition. And more broadly, we're going to get the beginning of what are going to be loosely referred to as neoliberal policies. These are defined in your textbook, but very broadly, more risk and more financial institutions that can take on more risk, more planned obsolescence, products that have a life cycle, and that they're designed to not last beyond a certain period of time, so people will have to replace them over and over again. Cars, computers, all of these are the obvious examples to that. More and more vertical disintegration. Progressively, those big centralized Fordist industries pull apart. And rather than making everything in one set of factories in one place, it becomes more profitable to ship out and to outsource different parts of the production process around the country and around the world. And what I refer to as more FIRE, which is an acronym standing for Finance, Insurance, and Real Estate. More and more cities are going to grow not so much based on the stuff they produce, but the value of property. If you've ever spent some time in New York or London or Tokyo, you'll know exactly what I mean by this. New York's major industry today is expensive real estate. Didn't always used to be that way. For a long time, New York City made a lot of stuff, but it is that way and has been that way for the last couple of decades. The big industry in London isn't manufacturing products anymore, or it isn't coal the way it used to be in the 19th century. It's the insurance industry. The outcome of all this has been that since the 1970s, increased growth in some parts of the world economy has also gone in hand with more inequality, more debt, more risk, and more intervention from big institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and later the WTO. In many respects, this is the era in which we are living right now. In our next lecture, we'll look more precisely and clearly at what some of these changes are, and specifically at the roles of the IMF and the WTO in helping to make these changes happen, what's been good and what hasn't been so good, with an eye towards thinking about how this can change and what to do about it.